Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning. We're really glad that you're joining us here today for our webinar called Why We Need to Eat Locally Grown Food. My name's Dr Stephanie Godrich, and I'm a Senior Lecturer from the School of Medical and Health Sciences at Edith Cowan University's Southwest Campus. Just some important things that we need to start with before we get into the webinar. I'd firstly like to respectfully acknowledge the past and present traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting today, the Noongar elders and people. I'd like to also let you know that there is a little Q&A chat box down the right side of your screen. So if you'd like to ask a question, if something pops up for you during the presentation, then feel free just to type a question there. We will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. If I don't get to answer your question, I will have my email address at the end on the last slide. So please do feel free to email your question to me and I'll make sure I get back to you after the presentation. And then lastly, we will send a link with a recording of this webinar to you just not long after it ends. And we'll also send you a little feedback survey that we welcome you to complete too. So what will we cover today? Well, I'm going to firstly just give you a little bit of background about me and my perspective on these kinds of issues around locally grown food. We're going to talk about what actually locally or regionally grown food is. I'm going to give you a little bit of information from some research we've done in the southwest and great southern regions of Western Australia about where and why people are actually buying regionally grown produce. I'm going to then broaden out and talk about why regionally and locally grown food is important. I'm going to introduce some very recent research data around the impact of COVID-19 on our food supply here in the Southwest region where I'm based. And then I'm going to give you some practical take-home strategies that we can all do to support regionally grown food. So just a little bit about me. I have been really privileged to work in a number of rural and remote communities across Western Australia. I've worked with almost 50 communities, and some photos across the top of your screen, you'll see some examples of the kind of work and where I was able to work. And I really saw firsthand a lot of challenges associated with not only being able to access healthy food, but quality and price issues as well. But I worked as a nutritionist, at which I have been doing for almost 15 years, and worked with people in communities looking at nutrition education, cooking skills, working with schools and families as well. I've also been really lucky to travel the world with my work. So the picture in the bottom left corner is actually a community garden on the roof of a hospital in Singapore, where they engage the local community in a voluntary capacity to grow food that is then distributed through the hospital. The picture in the bottom middle is actually from my time as a farmhand on a fruit, nut and vegetable farm in rural Spain. So I travelled there to really get a sense of what it's like to produce food and then look at markets for that and how we can distribute the regionally grown food. And then the last picture on the bottom right, I've also worked in Canada. So I've worked and met with a number of different levels of government to understand how they're supporting regionally grown food through their policies and their plans. So let's look now at what locally or regionally grown food actually means. Well, you might be a little bit surprised to know that there's no commonly agreed definition for what it is, but typically it talks about food that's grown, sold, and also consumed not far from where it's produced. So it's more of a local or regional type of area, markets. There have typically been two criteria that have been talked about a lot in the literature. So that's, of course, geography. So how distant the markets or where food is sold to where it's grown, and also organisational. So that's about how many intermediaries or steps between where food's produced to where it's consumed that there are. But more recently, there's been a third criteria applied or looked at, which is more that social criteria. So it's really looking at relationships between producers, consumers, or other people that are working across that food supply chain. Some terms that you might see or hear about locally grown food or food that's distributed through those shorter food supply chains are things like pick your own food or on-farm sales, sales to retail shops, so directly from the producer to a retail shop, or a direct sale through the internet, or we probably have all seen or been to farmers markets. So these are some examples of those direct food supply options or the shorter food supply chains. You might also see some common terms like alternative modes of food supply, food systems, or alternative food networks. And this is in contrast to the more larger scale industrial, conventional type of food systems. And then, of course, local or regional food supply or food systems have also been described as being more sustainable. So how then do Australians define regionally grown food? So we conducted some research in the southwest and Great Southern regions of Western Australia. So I know a number of people joining us today are from Perth, but this data is not too far away from where you're from. So we asked people a number of different questions around how they define regionally grown food and gave them some options for what they think it is. And people more often talked about it being available at their farmers market or available within their specific region that they lived in, less so available at their local supermarket and also within a 50-kilometre radius. So that's a bit in contrast to some of the other literature we see where internationally they tend to define it being more within a kilometre radius of where they live. So then where do people get regionally grown food from? Well, we asked people to talk about the different aspects or retail outlets or opportunities that they had to purchase regionally grown food and how frequently they did that. So you can see that the darkest shading in the graph there is about daily, so the frequency of getting regionally grown food daily, and that was more so through where they grew their own produce. If you look at the more darker turquoise colour, that's weekly, so you can see that people were most likely to purchase regionally grown food weekly from the independent supermarkets or your fruit and vegetable shops or your major supermarkets. And then less frequently monthly and rarely in areas like general or corner stores or at the farm gate. So then why do people obtain regionally grown food? We've talked about what it is, where people are getting it, but now let's look at why they're getting it. So the options that we gave to people across those different outlets and opportunities again were things like it was close to where they lived or worked, it offered them many choices, so looking at variety, it was good value for money, they enjoyed the experience or close to public transport. And you can see that the darker shading in the figure here shows that for the major supermarkets and the independent supermarkets, they were most oftenly described or chosen about the convenience factor, so that people purchase regionally grown food because it was convenient, it was close to where they lived and close to where they worked. But when we looked at that darker turquoise colour, it was more around the fruit and vegetable shops and the farmers markets offered perception of greater variety or more choices for their produce. And I should also say this is specifically looking at fruit and vegetables. And then in terms of enjoying the experience, the kinds of opportunities or areas where people obtain their regionally grown food was more around growing their own. It was looking at things like farmers markets. So it was more that social or the enjoyment factor that they were going to these sorts of opportunities. So then now let's look at what makes it hard for people to access regionally grown food. So some challenges that people reported was that there was a limited seasonal availability of regionally grown food, or a perception of a limited seasonal availability. They also said that they didn't know how to purchase these foods, and some other factors were transportation issues. So a lack of transport reportedly hindered their opportunity to get these kinds of foods. And then their food budget didn't allow them to purchase these foods. So there were a number of different things to unpack here and look at how we can support that a little bit more. In contrast, the motivations for people to purchase regionally grown food was that they thought that they were fresher. So a large majority of people that responded to the question said that they thought they were fresher. But then following that, it was more altruistic reasons for purchasing regionally grown food. So they really wanted to financially support their local farmers, and they wanted to support their local community financially too. And then following that, the quality was perceived to be better. So it was personal reasons around freshness and quality, but also those altruistic reasons too. So let's zoom out a little bit now and look a bit more broadly as to why regionally grown food is really important to support. Well, there's a number of factors, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but when we look at our nutrition or our health, if we are consuming a variety of different foods that is produced in season, so it's at its peak, we know that we're going to get a greater dietary diversity, so more of that variety. We know that when you consume regionally grown food, it is often fresher because it has less distance to go from where it's produced to where it's consumed. And there's definitely the perception in the literature about it being of a higher quality. When we look from an economic perspective, we know that regionally grown food or regional food systems really supports communities economically. So it really stimulates that vibrancy in rural economies. And think about all the employment opportunities that can come from that. So jobs in the picking, the packing, the freight, retail, the sales, and then really trying to preserve the sales value or retain it within that regional community or area too. Socially, it does bring consumers closer to the origins of their food, so they get the opportunity to learn a little bit more about how their food was produced, why it was produced in that way, through that more direct contact with producers, or at least if it's going through directly through retail outlets, then there is often the opportunity for producers to supply information to the retailers about their produce, which can then be conveyed to consumers. And it can also build trust amongst consumers for the producers and other people within the food supply chain. It can also increase a sense of pride and belonging due to the valuing of a product. If a product is really highly valued or products in a certain region, it can boost people's sense of pride for their community. There was a recent study done last year that looked across 7 countries in Europe and also in Vietnam, and they did find that the more direct producer to consumer type of sales options really did offer a greater gender equity or equality, I should say. So 30% more women were involved in those shorter food supply chains or more regionally grown food supply systems, in contrast to those longer, more distant options. There was also a greater perceived bargaining power amongst the producers and also the social connectedness amongst the different people working across the supply chain. From an environmental perspective, there is potentially less food loss along the supply chain because there's smaller opportunities or steps along the way of that supply chain for food to lose quality or to be destroyed, but that's also due to smaller volumes that are transported. And then looking at climate change, looking at how we can mitigate risks locally in the face of climate change, which does increase food supply resiliency too. So what's missing from the picture so far? Well, I haven't talked about COVID-19 yet, and now I'm just going to give you very superficial and early findings from some research we're doing right now in the Southwest region, and we're looking at how COVID-19 has impacted our food supply. So looking at food availability and food access. And I'm going to talk to you about some findings from some interviews we are conducting with people working in food supply. So producers, retailers, wholesalers, people working in institutions that provide food. So I'm going to give you some insights now. So when we've talked to people about how COVID-19's impacted the food supply, they've been telling us that, of course, and as you would probably know, a number of markets have just been lost for producers. For example, restaurants have closed down, so they might have lost quite a large proportion of their business. And also some farmers markets have closed down. Despite them being deemed an essential service, some organisers have closed markets because of the concern about people not social distancing. There have been also reduced farm gate sales for the farmers or producers that have utilised those particular supply options. So there were safety concerns about bringing members of the public onto their farms for the perception of the risk of transmission of the virus. But also we've had the intrastate border closures, which the Southwest region is a tourist region, and so we haven't had the tourists coming to increase the sales that way. There's also been some discussion around our just-in-time centralised food supply chain, which means that our current model is really, it's sometimes quite efficient in the way that if anything goes wrong at any part along the chain, there's a little bit of a lag time between when it can catch up. And you might have noticed that in supermarkets or outlets where there might have been some products that you've wanted to buy but weren't there, and it took a little while for it to catch up and then restock. There's also the comments around some producers have already invested time and money into planting seeds and seedlings, and then the virus hit. So they've got this produce that's already coming to ripeness or ready to be harvested. And instead of wasting that, they've re-diverted that through community goodwill. So it might have been supporting organisations, supporting vulnerable members of the community, or it could have been providing fruit and veg boxes or produce boxes for frontline health workers. There was also the discussion around some concerns about waste and plastic being used. So when you go into a retail outlet, you quite often see loose produce just stacked up nicely. Well, there's been concerns around people touching the produce and the safety associated with that. So there's reportedly a greater demand in that product being actually wrapped more or more bulk wrapped, which then has the ripple effects onto the plastic use that we've been working hard to reduce over time. There's also a perception that the consumers or people within the community have had an increased appreciation of where their food is coming from and potentially greater demand for regionally grown food rather than that which has come from large distances or been imported too. And then finally, another discussion has been around emergency food relief. So there have been some services closed, which has had some effects for people, vulnerable members of our community who do rely on that. And an example could be, for example, food that's provided, say, from a hospital to a food relief provider, which because of concerns of the virus, that has needed to stop. And so the reduction in opportunities for vulnerable members of our community to access food has been a challenge. So I've talked to you about the interviews phase of our project, and we also have another phase, which is our community survey. So here's an opportunity for anyone who is living in the Southwest. If you do want to get involved and tell us about your experience and what you've seen and experienced as a result of COVID-19 on your food availability and access, we do invite you to join in our community survey, and we'll send a link along with the recording of the presentation to provide you with that opportunity. So then how could we support regionally grown food more? I'm going to talk you through different levels of influence now, or different opportunities that we could all contribute to increase our support for regionally grown food. And I'm going to talk you through what's called a socio-ecological model. And this is not just looking at individual responsibility, it's looking at how we can all be part of the solution at different levels of influence. And starting off with the smaller sphere down the bottom, the intrapersonal or individual type of ways in which we could support regionally grown food could include things like considering where you source your regionally grown food near you. And there are opportunities for people who live in the city as well as those who live regionally, such as through things like farmers markets or retail outlets that might stock regionally grown food. There are other platforms online, such as Open Food Network, which stocks a lot of different producers in virtual shop fronts on their website. And then thinking about, are there any new opportunities that might have come from COVID-19 in terms of how businesses have adapted and changed their ways and become more innovative to offer more regionally grown produce? In terms of knowing where to find regionally grown food or knowing what's in season, the Buy West Eat Best campaign in Western Australia has a website that has lots of great information about that. So this might also contribute to overcoming some barriers I talked about a little bit earlier in terms of seasonal availability and not knowing where to purchase the foods from. And so these kinds of websites are really helpful for that. And then a third point is asking your retailer to label the provenance of their product, so where the food is grown, where it's come from, if they don't already. At a family or social networks kind of level, there are a couple of points for consideration here. So we could consider cooking with fresh seasonal produce in our family meals. You might have had more opportunity during the COVID-19 period to cook together and really think about how you can nourish yourselves with beautiful produce that we grow here in Western Australia. It has been a stressful time for a lot of people, and a lot of people have felt out of control, but the way in which we cook foods together and really enjoy them as a family could be a nice way to get together and really enjoy that social aspect of eating. If it's feasible for you, I do encourage you to visit a farm gate or farmers markets or other opportunities to learn a little bit more about how food is produced, where it's produced, and the kind of options available for you. And then thinking about how, as a family, potentially, if you don't already, you could consider growing your own to supplement your diet. I'm not suggesting that everyone can grow everything that they need from their backyard, but certainly it can be a helpful way to get a better understanding of the processes involved and then the reward at the end. At an organisational level, it's really important that institutions do support regionally grown food. For example, I know that there is already information in school curricula, and at a tertiary level, we certainly teach about local food systems and regionally grown food, but it's a great opportunity to enhance that and really build people's understanding and children's understanding from a young age about where their food is coming from and why it's important to support regionally grown food. School gardens can be a great opportunity and way to teach that as well, and I've certainly been involved in a number of different initiatives to provide education through a garden setting. And then a local food procurement policy can be a great opportunity for institutions to support regionally grown food, in that where they source their food from, if they're providing meals within their school or in the canteen, they could look at contracts for regionally grown producers as opposed to food that's come from further away. At a community level, it is important to support community advocacy for regionally grown food options. So we really do need to communicate to our government in terms of what our community wants to see happen and how we want to support regionally grown food. So there are various advocacy opportunities out there and different organisations promoting this. It's also important that our supermarkets or outlets promote the origins of our food and our provenance and where the food is grown from, so people are aware and informed and able to make informed decisions. And of course, that talks back to some of the barriers I was mentioning earlier about people not knowing where their food is from. Another opportunity is looking at stocking, appropriately pricing, and also promoting B grade or that ugly fruit and veg options too. And that's another strategy that can help support the perception of people's budget not being able to enable them to purchase regionally grown food. During the pandemic, I know that a number of retailers did relax their quality standards to enable more of this second grade produce into the market, just to try to keep up with demand. So it would be great to see that continue over time, so producers have an option for this produce, but also it enables lots of people in the community to be able to access regionally grown food. And then finally, promoting how the local economy is benefiting from regionally grown food. So we saw earlier, just in that sample that I talked about in the Southwest and Great Southern regions, people really wanted to talk about financially supporting their farmers and their local communities. So could we harness that interest and that appetite to really promote that a little bit more, just to give people that awareness of how it's actually contributing to the community? And then finally, at the public policy level, this is just a number of strategies that could be implemented. But of course, we do need to engage the local community in decision making about how we support regionally grown food in our communities and how we offer the opportunity for everyone to be able to access it. There are plans and policy mechanisms for supporting that, and I've certainly seen a number of great ones from places like Canada. And so this is a growing area of interest and opportunity. And certainly at even a local government level, with the development of public health plans that local governments are needing to develop over the next few years, there are opportunities to look at if and where it's suitable for that local government, how we can preserve agricultural land or even look at urban agriculture as opportunities too, and really ensuring equitable access for all members of our community, because where you live shouldn't dictate what quality and amount of good nutritious produce that you can afford. Infrastructure and sales are also really important. So a number of conversations over a number of years that I've had with producers have talked about the need for better infrastructure and for example, mobile abattoirs or other opportunities to support the packing and distribution of food throughout a region too, and different avenues for sales. Again, local food procurement comes up, which I've already talked about, but state or local government owned facilities could support regionally grown food through the food that they are providing within their centres and places that they own. And of course, agritourism and food trails could be another avenue to support greater interest in regionally grown food and where food's coming from. And I've also been part of discussions with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people talking about in some areas where they might be interested in looking at native food trails and more social enterprises to look at how they can create a great little food business opportunity for some amazingly nutritious native foods. And then looking finally at education and promotion and also support for more community-driven initiatives and social enterprise models that have a community benefit too. So again, these aren't exhaustive lists of strategies, but they're just some ideas in which we could think about how we could support regionally grown food across different levels of influence. So just to wrap things up, some take-home messages that I'd like to share with you. Regionally grown food does relate to those shorter food supply chains, so looking at opportunities like those direct sales, farmers markets and other opportunities to get food grown in a region to consumers. Regionally grown food does make a number of different contributions across social, economic, environmental and health. And we are all part of the solution to this. It's not just individual responsibility, but as I've shown you, there are different levels of influence that we could really tap into and harness to help support regionally grown food a bit better. So I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors and my team members in the research that I've presented here today. And of course, a sincere thanks to all of the participants who've joined in the various research studies, because without them, we wouldn't have any research to talk about. If I don't get to answer your questions today, as I mentioned, here are my contact details, and be sure to send me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to have a look at the questions now and answer those and have a bit of a discussion. So I've got a question from Nikki about the Southwest survey data from the COVID impact survey. And yes, so the data that I talked about in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the food supply, that is within the Southwest region. So we'll have results for that a little bit later on in the year. For the interviews, we are still collecting interviews. So as I said, they're just some preliminary findings. So we'll collect more interviews, analyse that information along with the community survey, and we'll feed the information back to the community, either through an in-person forum if we can, or a webinar or some other way of communicating with the community. And we certainly hope to work with government and industry to look at some recommendations that might come out of those two phases of the study. So feel free to type any questions if there's something else you'd like to know, or even a comment to add to the discussion? Okay, so we haven't seen any more questions come through, which is completely fine. Sometimes people want to have a little think and digest about the content first, but certainly if there are any other questions that you have, I'm very happy to answer those. Oh, we've just had a question come through. So what's an argument that you could use when talking about local produce, which might cost more than supermarket produce? It's a great question, and this is certainly an area that we do need more objective research findings about, because a lot of research so far has talked about community perceptions or consumer perceptions that food that is grown locally and sold locally is more expensive than things that are imported. But we haven't seen a lot of really good quality data that categorically shows that. So it's more about people's perceptions of that. I did look at a research study that was conducted last year in Europe, and they did actually find in some cases, some of those more direct food supply chains offered the producers a greater return on investment and a greater price premium. So that does suggest that consumers were needing to pay more there. So certainly where some locally grown food is more expensive, you know, that's a challenge for some aspects or some people within our community. However, there are a number of avenues, such as some farmers markets. When you look at just the raw product that hasn't been value added and other things added to make it more expensive, quite often it is the same price or even sometimes cheaper than what's available in the supermarket as well. So it really does depend on the way in which the food is distributed and sold in terms of the supply chain that's used. So there is another question about whether locally grown food is more often produced organically, or is there no relation? Sometimes it is, not always. So it really does depend on the farm and their market that they're trying to go for. Quite often in the evidence base, you will see that the regionally grown food, it's smaller sort of size businesses, so they might be looking at less reliance on pesticides or chemicals, so they might be looking at more companion planting or those organic type of practices. But we certainly do need some more research in that area. So it's not always linked, in terms of regionally grown foods, not always linked with being organic, but it is quite often in some cases. So how does the direct export from the farm of milk, fruit, vegetables, I'm not sure if it's saying, does it impact food availability locally? Sometimes it certainly can, in some areas where food is produced and then it's sold for an export market, or it is sold through a variety of channels and then might come back to that place of origin or produce. There have been reports about, well, we know that Australia produces far more food than it actually needs, and we do know that we have a significant export market. So it can sometimes, depending on the markets that those producers want to use, it could potentially divert that regionally grown produce away from communities to an export market. But again, it depends on the supply chains that those farmers are choosing to use. And I think we need to look at, well, what is viable for farmers and what kinds of supply chain options are going to be viable for them and useful for them for their different motivations as well. So it's not just from an economic standpoint, but what else can we use in our argument for supporting the retention of that business, and really looking at opportunities to better support that. So really supporting farmers to produce food within their region and look at markets that are available for them. And that's what I was saying a little bit earlier in the recommendations around infrastructure and sales. So really trying to create those enabling factors for more sales of the regionally grown food locally. So not needing to rely so much on export. Another question is, will there be any surveys in Perth? That certainly could be a possibility in the future. I am based in the southwest region, and as you saw at the introduction, I have a lot more probably of a passion for rural and remote areas, just because I know that they are quite often underrepresented in projects, and so that's certainly where my area of passion lies. But that's not to say that there won't be any Perth or metropolitan based research done in the future. Certainly very interested in looking at how that might be different, because of course, you know, if there is food produced away from the city, we have a different set of challenges, don't we? So it's really important to look at different barriers and motivators for people who live in urban environments too, which of course is a large proportion of the population. So there's a question about how a specific outlet was treated in the survey in terms of the categorization. So I can't talk about specific examples or the specific outlet. I can't name them. So unfortunately, I can't answer that question. But it's important to look at different definitions of what is a retail outlet, what is a farmer's market, what is other opportunities for that regionally grown produce or that supply chain. So, but we do have different categories of market types or supply chains that we have used in our study. Okay, that's all the questions that we have for now. But as I said, if anything's come up for you or you've had to think about anything you'd like to know a bit more, I'm happy to chat with you either via phone or email. You can certainly get in contact with me at the email address on that slide there. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Hopefully there's been something that you've taken out of today's webinar. And hopefully we can increase the awareness and valuing and importance of regionally grown food. So thanks for joining us.